Hi Joanne, thank you so much for coming on Commonplace. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. This is such a fun idea for a podcast. I used to love Commonplace books, so this is fabulous.
Yeah, I've had a couple of historians on now and they said how, they wanted the opportunity to talk about this sort of thing, so it's been great. Um, so I think people familiar with the Tudor period will already know a bit about your work, but could you just start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your work?
Sure, yes. So I'm a historian, roughly of sort of the Tudor and Renaissance periods. I've been a historian for many years now. I trained as an intellectual historian, which means the history of ideas. So that was what my PhD was in. I did that at Queen Mary University of London. I've published on a variety of thinkers and topics, covering everything from intellectual history, political history, cultural history. And in recent years, I've been really turning to writing more narrative history. So I published The House of Dudley, about three generations of the very scandalous Dudley family, in 2022, I believe it was. And then I've just last year published my biography of Thomas More, and it's come out in paperback last month.
Yeah, I have that beautiful paperback here.
Ah,
Very much enjoying it.
it's behind
Wonderful.
me as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, it really stood out when I saw it in Waterstones.
Yeah, they always do such a
It's
wonderful job with
gorgeous.
my covers.
Yeah.
I have a great team.
Yeah, it's one of the best ways of doing Tudor history, I always think, because we know about these massive events, but we've heard these names thrown around as well, but it's seeing what it was like, day by day for them, going through those momentous occasions.
Yeah, that's very much part of my philosophy, I guess, if I have one,
Yeah.
which is that I think it's important. Well, let's put it this way. I think a historian's job is to help others understand the past. And there's two ways of understanding the past. One is at a sort of very intellectual level, where we understand what happened and the dates and the events and so on. And is the other way is to understand it more viscerally, emotionally, which requires, I think, borrowing techniques from fiction, from narrative storytelling. And so that's what I try to do.
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about your most recent book, if that's okay. So, he's kind of the man, the myth, the legend. He's writer, lawyer, philosopher, politician, martyr, and, of 1935, a saint as well. So, he obviously creates very strong and divisive feelings among historians. Some see him as a saint, some see him as a persecutor. So what got you first interested in Thomas More as a figure?
I have to say it was none of those sorts of things. And in fact, what was the controversy around him that made me somewhat hesitant to work on him. I first, I mean, obviously I'd known him and read Utopia as an undergraduate and so on, but I first, particularly started working on him in a detailed way during my PhD. And it was after that a former colleague of mine who had become a commissioning editor asked me to write just a sort of short introductory work on Thomas More's ideas. And I initially said no, because of all that controversy, because of his very contested legacy. I say in the opening of the book that he's one of the most, if not the most divisive people in English history, if you think about the extremes of the views that are held about him. But after some thought, I realized, well, I'm just working on his ideas, on his writings. I don't have to get into all of that. But on the back of that, because it came out around the quincentenary of the publication of Utopia, there were lots of events. I was talking to lots of people, and people asked what was the best biography. And I couldn't recommend, there are very, very good biographies of Thomas More that were published in the 20th century, but I couldn't recommend any without adding certain qualifications about, well, this is from this perspective, it's, you'll need to read around that to really understand what they're saying, and so on. And so finally I came to the realization that we needed a new biography of Thomas More. And yes, I guess perhaps I should write it.
Yeah.
And once I'd accepted that, I just became so excited and thrilled by the project, as daunting as it was.
That's really interesting that you say that, actually, because I see a lot of parallels between the work I've done on Mary Queen of Scots and how I got
Yeah.
interested in her. And I did my dissertation supervised by John Guy, and he talked a lot about the book he did for the Reputation series to me, telling me.
So I love that book.
Yeah, and he was telling me a lot about also, you know, how little was known about his canonization and the process of that, and these documents went sort of unseen for forever basically, and his ex-supervisors, you know, never knew, you know, was there anything against him becoming, you know, a saint, and there was actually nothing in the end, and he just found these documents, sort of came across them by accident, and it was, you know, it was amazing to hear that from him. You know, that Catholic Protestant propaganda thing really is something I've looked at quite a lot, so I really resonate with that.
I have to say that was always the sort of qualification I'd add is, okay, we'll read Richard Marius's biography, but also read John Guy's book in the Reputation series to kind of give you some perspective on that. And it's really interesting. I mean, John Guy is one of the great historians of Thomas More, has written a number of books sort of around him and around his biography, but concluded that he didn't think that a truly historical biography of Thomas More was possible.
He said he was quite reluctant to take it on as well when he was asked. It's a weighty thing.
Exactly. So I have had a correspondence with him, and he did admit that he thinks it is possible. I haven't heard his opinion on my book yet, but that was encouraging.
So you've started in the preface of your book kind of describing Thomas More as this man who's willing to speak truth to power, and you made a few kind of, you know, modern parallels in dangerous circumstances. So what can we learn about Thomas More's particular rise and fall from power, and his relationship with Henry VIII, and what that tells us about politics in the Tudor court?
I think there's a number of takeaways, and I'm always interested to hear what other people are taking away from this book. I mean, for me, there's two perhaps main things. One is when you talk about his rise and fall, we have to appreciate that he's coming from a very humble background, more humble, I discovered than I think we've often thought. His birthplace is not where the plaque is in London, and that he was one of a number of people who experienced dramatic rises and falls in the Tudor period. You think about Cromwell, Wolsey, the list goes on, and so he really is in that cohort of what's called the new men in the Tudor period, and that's a strategy that first Henry VII and then Henry VIII adopt in order to have this sort of breed of competent administrators who are wholly dependent on the crown, who it costs nothing really to tear them down, and really become a great way of distracting the nobility, who are useless at these jobs, from being, that gives them someone else to hate other than the king themselves, gives them another target, another enemy. So it's this brilliant strategy, and Thomas More really, I think, is a great example of that. By the time he becomes Lord Chancellor, it's because they're not interested in having anyone who has any other source of power as Lord Chancellor. He's put in that position because he's easily put down again. I think the other thing is what you were saying about speaking truth to power and more strategy in doing that. When you read the letters, when you read the documents, it's very clear that he does adopt this very sort of compromised middle way position, very similar to the one he sets out in Utopia, in trying to speak truth to power. He doesn't want to come out and just sort of declare his views very loudly and very publicly. He doesn't want to offend the king because he wants to be in the room where it happens. He doesn't want to lose the king's ear by yelling in it. And so this strategy, I think, is a very useful one for understanding the way that politics and power worked in the Tudor period.
Yeah, and sometimes we look at things, you know, like his downfall and think it's quite sudden. You know, he took this stance against the great matter, but he's probably expressing those views for quite a while. Like, you know, like in politics today, it's a slow build-up. It's not this dramatic rise and fall that we suggest when we see these timelines.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the writing was on the wall for a very long time. At least, you know, people like Eustace Chapuis, from the moment really that More becomes Lord Chancellor, is worried about Thomas More and thinks that the king is angry with him, which is probably correct.
Yeah, and there's not that inevitability, you know, there should just be sort of whisperings that meant nothing, but to us they mean something more because we know the outcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's been described in many ways, but I think there's a lot of confusion over his sort of beliefs, if in a way that, you know, he's been described as a reformist Catholic, a humanist, which obviously has a different meaning than what it means today. And some see him as sort of standing in the way of progress. So could you just explain a little bit what his moral and religious ideas were?
I could try. It's not something that I think can be done very briefly. I've now written 2 books on the subject and a variety of articles. But I think you're right. I think, you know, we know more as the man for all seasons. And I often take that to mean the way that we use him in different ways according to the season, you know, according to our needs. You're absolutely right. He's been called a reformist, a conservative, a radical. He's been called a communist. He's been called an authoritarian, right? Like every sort of spectrum, end of the political spectrum that you can think of. I think More was a reformer. That's certainly the case. He believed in social reform. He was very critical in particular of what he saw as a sin of pride, which we might actually think of as a sort of individualism, extreme individualism, the idea that we have the authority in ourselves to determine what we think is right. He was against that. He thought that we need to go to not really tradition, but the sense of a collective determining what's right and wrong, and the rules for religion, politics, what have you. He was very interested in the common good over the individual good, for instance. And that is consistent across his writings, from his very, very first little, bits of poetry right up to what he's writing in the Tower. But it's the circumstances around him really that change. And so, whereas before the subjects of his criticism were bishops and popes and kings and what have you, they shift. So that the real threat, as he sees it, comes from Lutherans, particularly, and that theology, which he sees as extremely, as we would say, individualist, prideful. And so he starts to look like a conservative because he starts defending church institutions and so on, instead of criticizing them. But really, the problem remains the same for him.
Yeah, so he found a sort of creative outlet for these ideas. You talked about that kind of collective idea of right and wrong through his work as a scholar. People know him in different spheres, but obviously Utopia, you've mentioned, was a way for you getting interested in more. And in this, he kind of outlines a semi-fictional island of, customs, cultural, new laws, and sort of an ambiguous vision of, it can mean good place, no place. So what do you think that Thomas More was thinking while he was writing Utopia? Was it an ideal place in his mind?
Oh, wouldn't I love to know? A great question, a question that has sort of plagued scholars for 500 years. Utopia is intentionally enigmatic. It's a puzzle, and it's intended to be a puzzle. It's intended... I don't know if he had in mind 500 years of people scratching their head about Utopia, but I don't think he would have minded. It's supposed to be layers of fact and fiction. As you say, it's a fantasy island, but the book itself is grounded in reality. He himself is a character, but is it really him? All of these sort of riddles that are built into it. I think primarily it is a statement about common good over private good. It's also a statement about how we live that, how we try to live a life that reflects the priority of the common good over the individual good, the private good. And that's sort of explored in 2 parts, which are the 2 books of Utopia. The first is a dialogue over whether a educated, experienced person, man, like Thomas More, should enter the service of a king. And really, at the heart of this debate is that question of, do you put your own good over that of the common good? Because entering the service of the king is very dangerous, right? But you have a duty, he believes, to the Commonwealth, to the common good. And so you have to put that over and above your individual good. And then the second part is explored in this description of the island itself, which takes very literally the idea of the common good being put first, because everything is held in common. There's no private property, there's no social status, and what have you. And I think, you know, and I go into why I think this in the biography and in various other articles I've written. But I think really the point is, for more, to understand that all of those things that we take pride in, wealth, status, property, what have you, are fiction, right? They're made up, right? They're as we would say now, they're constructions, right? They're artificial. Whereas actually in Utopia, which is a made-up place, they live by sort of real principles, by real things. Gold has no extreme value because it's not that useful, right?
Well, they use it to make the chains or something, don't they? Something
they
really.
Make chains. Yeah. They make chains out of it, which is of course itself a statement about chains of office, right? And servitude. But they also use it for chamber pots, for toilets, for you know, for waste, because that's what it's kind of useful for. It's not good for other things. So, yeah, I think it's a statement about understanding, still living in the world. He talks about the stage play, but understanding that it's all made up fundamentally, and not placing undue value in things like wealth or social standing or property.
Well, it's incredible that he published it under his own name, because, you know, it's radical to us today, but in 1516, you know, it's amazing that he didn't face any sort of repercussions then from writing something like that.
Well, he did a really good job in the framing of it. It is a riddle for that reason, but it's also in some sense harmless because it doesn't have a specific, you know, target. Henry is praised in the book. There is a king who's talked about who resembles Henry VII, but Henry VIII kind of didn't mind that because he wanted his reign in contrast to Henry VII. So he kind of didn't mind if people were a bit critical of his dad. So, you know, there isn't a particular target. And humanist reformers went much further than Utopia in their criticisms. You know, Erasmus got a lot of flack for Praise of Folly, which is in a similar sort of vein. But it does speak, I think, as you say, to his reformist and maybe even a little bit radical critique of society.
Yeah, I suppose it was probably viewed more in the vein of, you know, like classical poets writing the Aeneid or something.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, they were all aspiring to that sort of writing.
Yeah. So you've just mentioned Erasmus, and of course that was, he counted More as one of his closest friends, and he was probably one of the most prominent 16th century thinkers. So what insights do you think we can gain from their exchanges and their intellectual bond?
They're a fascinating scholarly couple, let's say that. And I think we have a vision of their friendship that when you actually read the letters maybe isn't what was actually happening. I mean, both Erasmus and More, Erasmus especially, were fantastic at what has been called the art of self-fashioning, which isn't that different from, you know, what we might do on social media today, right? This projection of a particular persona and lifestyle and an idea of the self that might not be what is reality. And part of that was this construction of an idea of a republic of letters, this community of scholars spread across Europe, who supported each other, defended each other, occasionally attacked each other, and that was often a performance as well, to keep people interested in some ways in their ideas. And so Thomas More and Erasmus didn't get off to the best start. They met in 1499. At the same time, they met the young Prince Henry, who at the time was not the heir to the throne. And Erasmus was slightly embarrassed by the occasion because Thomas More had prepared a piece of poetry for the prince. He had not. And so they sort of got in a bit of a squabble over dinner. But within a few months, they were corresponding, and Erasmus was speaking very highly of Thomas More. But in some ways, it was a very one-sided relationship. Erasmus was a very prolific letter writer, very prolific letter writer. There was a statistic, and I won't come up with it now, but it's something like 100 or hundreds of letters written a day on average. Like, it was just ridiculous, and he'd get very annoyed that Moore was not sort of keeping up with it. But Moore had 4 kids and several jobs, and I just don't think he thought it was that much of a priority, except when he was trying to get Utopia published, and then it flips the other way, and he's the one sending tons and tons of letters at Erasmus. So they were using each other a little bit in this as well. And what's interesting too is we don't have a single letter between them the whole time that Moore is Lord Chancellor. And I think that Erasmus was very critical of Moore's choice to become Lord Chancellor, if we can call it a choice. And so there's no letters between them. But then it picks up again afterwards. And I think Erasmus is genuinely heartbroken by the death of Moore, and he himself dies only a year later.
That's really fascinating. Quite a unique bond they had there. And you think about, the sort of performative debating they have. It sort of makes you think about PMQs or something, trying to get the wider audience into these kind of elite ideas, I guess.
Well, yeah, or you think again about, social media, and various intellectuals will sort of go
Squabble
at each other.
Then, probably
exactly,
friendly
but
texting
really
in
privately,
between.
they get on.
Yeah.
It's all part of it.
I'm not sure what year it was, but doesn't Erasmus write this quite striking account of Moore, describing quite kind of ordinary things about him, even sort of comparing him to Achilles and describing him as a soldier of faith, almost like he knew that he would sort of go on to become this kind of sainthood figure.
Yeah, so I think the letter you're describing is the very long one he writes to von Hutten in, now I'm forgetting as well. We'll call it the 1520s. I think it's the early 1520s. I'll look it up after. I should know. But yeah, it's a profile of Thomas More. Everything from his eye color, his height, his voice, what he sounded like, his character, and so on. And yeah, it's. In some sense, we know that some of it's accurate. We can corroborate it with other sources and so on. But we also understand that it's part of this self-fashioning. He's trying to describe more for this reading audience. And absolutely, it's a praise of him. Of course, he had written Praise of Folly, which also meant Praise of More, earlier as well. And so there's these very sort of public pronouncements of this affection and this relationship between them.
Yeah, he really was more sort of early PR man by the sounds of it. He was quite dedicated to that. So I'd like to touch a bit on Moore's attitudes towards education a bit more. And in contrast to many of his contemporaries, he took quite an enlightened approach to the education of women, especially taking an interest in the education of his daughters. So could you talk a little bit about that?
This is something that really surprised Erasmus, actually. He's one of the contemporaries who thought that women can't be educated, shouldn't, it's a waste of resource to try. Erasmus, not so great on women. But Thomas More believed profoundly that women had the capacity to be educated, that they had reason in the same way that men did, and he carried that through. He put it into practice not only with his 3 daughters but other women in his household. He had what we might think of as sort of adopted daughters, other young women of an age with his daughters that he educated and brought into his family, and he educated them to quite a high level as well. There's a famous letter written to their tutor in which he outlines this philosophy, this belief, and he actually says that the reason that men have held women back from education is because they're afraid they'll show them up. Because men have become lazy, right, as scholars, and so you get these women coming up who are really passionate about it and engaged and hardworking, and they'll have to up their game too. And so they and I think there's something true in that. And so he knew why there was this sort of jealousy of keeping women back from education. We always have to preface this by understanding that he was not advocating for the same application of education as for men. This was to make them better wives, mothers better governors of their household for their domestic role, not for a public role like boys would be educated for. But the education was essentially the same. And his eldest daughter published. All three of his daughters disputed before the king. People writing home going, whoa, these women, they disputed before the king, and they were impressive. Who knew? And I think what's important too is we know, particularly from Erasmus, that this had an effect. It changed Erasmus's mind on the education of women. And he said that it changed the minds of many people in the English court, but also abroad. He talks about the court of Charles V, to which he was attached at the time, and that noblemen started going, oh, I guess I could educate my daughters too. I guess that'd be all right. So it was profoundly influential.
Yeah, I love that anecdote about them disputing before the king. I mean, Mary Queen of Scots did that, when she was young in France as well, so that it was out there. It just sort of...
Yeah.
And then you've got that beautiful Holbein portrait where he's sort of advertising the virtues of educating women. And they're holding those books of Livy. It's really,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's such a unique Tudor portrait, the Holbein. It's one of Holbein's first paintings in England when he first comes over in 1520. I think he arrives in 26 and this is in 27. Most of them are holding books of classical learning. They're really although More is at the center with his father, they're kind of the focal point of the painting in many ways. That sort of more light is put on them. They're essential to it. We know as well from his letters that he wanted them to challenge their role. He says in one letter to his daughter right before she gets married that he would always, of course, advise her to take advice and to sort of bow to the authority of her husband. But, maybe except in matters of astronomy in which she could, teach him a thing or two. This idea that he's encouraging them to stand on their learning and in some sense their own sense of authority.
Yeah, it's encouraging them to trust that basis that he's given them, really, that this education really is, it's as good as any you're going to get. So, trust in yourself and, stand up when you know something's wrong. So you've sort of talked, you wanted to create this balanced view of Thomas More as far as possible. And of course, in popular culture, he's the man of all seasons. And I love the way you talk about him as being a man of all seasons in that you can pick and choose different aspects of him. But, obviously in that, he's quite a kind of almost sort of borderline saintly character. And then you've got Mantell as him as this wolfly heretic hunter. So sort of what do you hope that people will take away from your book in changing the way that they look at Thomas More?
It's a great question. I think certainly those things that I mentioned, the way that we can understand more about the Tudor court, about strategies for speaking truth to power, both then and now. But I think most of all, both of those, we were talking about some fantastic works of fiction in Man for All Seasons and Wolf Hall, right? Just really one of the great films of the 20th century, one of the great novels of I think it came out at the beginning of the 21st. But in any case, these are fantastic portrayals of characters that are indeed drawn from 16th century sources. Bolt was reading Chambers' biography, which was pulling from the Catholic sources, the sources close to his family, his son-in-law's account, and so on. Mantell is reading Richard Marius, the biography in the 80s, which is pulling from the Protestant sources, John Foxe and so on, who are condemning More's actions. And so they have these historical bases, but from these two very different religious perspectives who are sort of, at war at the time and using the figure of Thomas More for their own arguments. But when what I wanted to do was to treat Thomas More as I'd treat any historical figure, which would not be to go to these posthumous sources, but to go to the historical record. And so that was what I was very dedicated to doing. Of course, I do use those sources, but I'm careful about them, as you would always be. And so, back to your question about what I would want people to take away, I'd want them to understand the complexity of this human individual, maybe take lessons about the complexity of all human individuals, to understand, and that doesn't mean to justify or legitimate, to understand those things that trouble us about him. His persecution of heresy, his very vehement, violent writings against heretics, to understand where they come from, because reasonable, very intelligent, genius level people, as I think Thomas More was, still get led into violent hatred of groups today, right? And unless we understand that not as something anomalous, or he was just evil, or what have you, unless we understand why that happens, I think it becomes more difficult to prevent in even in ourselves. So I think I want people to understand at a very sort of detailed and intimate level all the facets of this very complicated person.
Yeah, that was so beautifully articulated, and I think
Thank you.
it's so true, because he was a decent man, but you have to put yourself back in the circumstances of the time, and he thought genuinely he was doing the best for humanity by trying to dispel heresy, and just as I'm sure Mary the First thought the same thing.
Well, and I think what I would want to drive home is the fear. He was afraid. And I think fear, I almost end up almost quoting Star Wars when I try to say this, but fear can lead to hatred, right? And the way in which fear of a group, can lead to these statements, and these views of individuals, and the stripping away of their humanity to the point of advocating for executing them in the most horrible way conceivable. I think that there are lessons in that, the way that fear is used to stir up hatred, and I think that is what that fear overrode the decency, if we want to put it that way, in someone like Thomas More, and that's a lesson I think across history and today.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout history you can see examples of that, but I think the 16th century especially is a good way for us to look back and learn from those lessons. That's so important. Yeah. So if we could just get back to sort of commonplace books, I'm sure, everything that Thomas More, wrote and said could really warrant a commonplace book that we've got for him already. But is there somebody else, or it could be Thomas More, that you'd like to have the commonplace book of?
Gosh, you know what? I'm gonna say his because yes, Thomas More, but I've read enough of his writings. I'd love to have the commonplace book of his daughter, Margaret More Roper. Any of his daughters would be fantastic. But she, I think, would be the most likely to have one. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be over the moon excited and desperate to get my hands on it, but I wouldn't be that surprised if we found one, from her. She's the sort of person who conceivably would have a commonplace book, so I would adore to see hers.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall we get to your commonplace book? Obviously this is a time, you've got illuminated manuscripts, you've got, black letter print. So what's kind of your aesthetic? What would your commonplace book look like?
Oh, it'd probably be a mess. I think a lot of them were
an ordered
messes. Yeah. Yes, I would try to order it best I could, and I think I'd use the common headings of the time and so on. But I think it would be one. I'd probably never get around to having it illuminated or printed or anything else. I think you'd see lots of different inks in there. You'd be able to tell when I was doing it late at night. I think probably like that fantastic manuscript that every once in a while makes the rounds on the internet, on social media, it would have cat paw prints across it. It'd be one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, probably one of the best ones, to look back on, and they're always finding new bits. They're never done with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
So you've talked about, your basis in the history of ideas. So I'm sure you've come across a lot of philosophies that you agree with and you sort of have a bit of trouble sort of resonating with. So is there a quote or a philosophy that's had an impact on your life?
Probably many, and this is why I think commonplace books were so useful, is because we're not as good now at writing them down. Um, Gosh, this is hard. There's a great one from Thomas More, and I probably won't get it exactly right now, but it essentially is that the prideful man can't stand ridicule, or something along those lines. Many people will now email me with the exact correct quote. But it's this idea that those who are very prideful, the biggest and most important weapon you have against them is to laugh at them, to point and laugh at them. And I think that's fabulous for our times. And I think those people who are currently pointing and laughing at the prideful are doing very important work. They're doing the work that Thomas More was doing in the 16th century.
Yeah.
I will say as well that I do kind of have a commonplace book, which is actually on my monitor in front of me right now. I have post-its that cover around my monitor of various quotes that, motivate me or ground me when I'm working. And I'll give you the last one I added, which is that pressure is a privilege. I love that one. I think it's Billie Jean King said it first, the tennis player. But I love that one. And so when I'm working and I'm feeling very pressured or, taking on a daunting task like writing a biography of Thomas More, that's a privilege. So I love that one.
Yeah, it's a bit like the, what a privilege it is to go mad over the thing of your choosing.
That's great. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the thing you said about political satire, of course, the 18th century went crazy on that, but you can see the beginnings of it in the sort of the 16th century.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so, yeah.
So is there a photograph, or it can be a copy of a piece of art that you would like to, go back and look at in your commonplace book?
Oh, goodness. Trying to think, personal or professional here.
It can be one of each.
Yes, yeah, certainly. One that I've worked on quite a bit, and I think is interesting on a number of levels, is there was an image, almost borders on a symbol, an emblem in the 16th century, drawn from classical sources, of the figure of Occasio, or occasion, or opportunity. And this idea that she was bald in the back, but had a long, what they call a forelock, or sort of fringe at the front. So you had to grab her as she was approaching. You couldn't grab her once she was gone, and she had wings on her feet, and all of this sort of thing. And yes, there is some problematic stuff going on here about seizing a woman, and which I think the history of that is worth remembering. But this idea of seizing the opportunity, because once it's gone, was very much a part of the Renaissance mindset. And almost every humanist was aware of this. This idea often appears in commonplace books in various forms throughout the Renaissance and onward. So yes, I think that's a good one. I've even considered having it tattooed on me. I haven't, but I think other people have. I think it's one of those that just crops up cyclically through history.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the tattoo, actually, because somebody else I had on said, there's something, written by her daughter that meant a lot to her, and, she'd write it in the commonplace book as kind of testing it for a tattoo, so that seems to be a theme.
Yeah.
But yeah, tattooing it in the commonplace book might...
Yeah.
Try
well,
it out.
I think a lot of people use tattooing and their bodies as commonplace books.
That's true.
Now,
Yeah.
it's I think there's a study to be done there in the way in which the body has become, we've moved from vellum, from animal skins, to our own skins.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah, never thought of it like that, really. Is there a song or a poem that stuck with you? And do you like to listen to music while you're working, or is it something you do to kind of uplift you when you're not?
Yes, I almost always have music on when I'm sat here. When I'm writing, I tend to, it's instrumental. I mean that in the sense of no lyrics,
Yes.
but it's also instrumental. I tend to listen actually to a lot of film scores. I find that very motivating when I'm writing, and I actually have playlists for my different projects. So just now I was actually going back to some House of Dudley stuff, and I put on my House of Dudley playlist. So I do that, and then when I'm emailing or doing admin, it's, you know, very motivating pop music.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I've always adored and pretty much consistently cried at A Wonderful World. I think What a Wonderful World. I think that's one of my favorites, and it is poetry in a lot of ways. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow, they'll learn much more than I'll ever know, is such a brilliant line. It's the kind that expands your brain as you hear it, but also clutches your heart. Yeah, and it has transformed in meaning as I've grown, as well, and is part of, I think, the project of what we do as scholars. Is understand that what we know is such a fraction, is such a tiny thing of what can be known and what will be known.
Yeah, What a Wonderful World, actually, I've sung it at a couple of events before, and there was a survivor of the Falklands War, his name escapes me, but he's quite a prominent speaker about it. That was his favourite song. Yeah. I was just also interested in your playlists. Are they related to the figure you're writing about? Are they soundtracks from films related, or are they sort of just things that you happen to be enjoying at that time?
Sometimes, yes. So they often, they're more in keeping with the tone of what I'm trying to write, but they are related to the subject. Actually, I mean, my House of Dudley one is public. You can find it on Spotify. I don't think I've made the Thomas More one public yet, but maybe I will right now. And so, yeah, there's it's sort of to get me in a particular place emotionally, and also a particular time. And so the hope is that it aids that sense of drama and sort of world building as I write.
Yeah, I'm interested because I know that you've used it a couple of times on your reels. The ma ma ma. Yeah, I thought that was really clever.
Yes,
I doubt it was actually on the playlist while you were writing, but I mean, more of a celebration afterwards.
Yeah, but I mean, I've got some. I'm just looking at the Thomas More one now. You know, I've got some stuff from the time. There's some Thomas Tallis. There's some bardcore, if you know what bardcore is. There's some bardcore on there. There's a soundtrack from Becoming Elizabeth. There's some fantastic. There's someone who does very sort of choral church chant music with saxophone. I'm gonna get the name wrong. Jan Garbarek, I think is the name. I've got tons of him. Just all, you know, there's some Wolf Hall on there. I mean, that's such a fantastic score. For the book I'm working on now, there's a lot of Wolf Hall. There's some Tudors in there. They did this fantastic soundtrack to The Hollow Crown. That's on there. Anyway, it's just such a mix of things, but they're designed to get me as a writer to a particular place.
Yeah, it's getting you away from your everyday life, and you know what your narrative history especially is doing is getting into their world, which, you know, music's the best way to do that, I guess. Yeah, even when it's posthumously written, you know, as a soundtrack, it's still using influences from, you know, Dowland and Tallis and all those composers.
Well, and again, that's about getting me emotionally to a place and adding a sense of sort of drama to and tension to the writing, which is just as important.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. What's your utopia? Is that, you know, if you could have a postcard from a particular place in the world, where would that be?
I mean, I'd take one from Utopia. That'd be quite cool.
Yeah.
I do actually have postcards with the map of Utopia on them, but that's not quite the same thing. Oh gosh, I mean, my mind just goes to the fact that I don't want a postcard, I want to go there.
Yeah.
I haven't traveled as widely as, I always thought I would. There's so many places I'd like to go. The last, I went on a really wonderful holiday to Greece some years ago that was really special. And I went to a place called Pylos. And it was just the most beautiful mix of sort of nature and ruins and the sea. And I don't even know, it's quite a small town, I don't even know if they do postcards, but yeah, in some sense it felt utopian to me. That was a very special place for me, but yeah, I don't really want a postcard from anywhere. I just want to go there and get the postcard and then put it in my book.
Yeah, fair enough. So you read a lot of academic books from your peers and everything, but is there a book that you'd record in your Commonplace book that, for prosperity, you want people to keep reading? It can be a classic, it can be new.
My favourite novel is a book called Dream of Scipio by Ian Pearce. It's not his best known work, that's Instance of a Finger Post, which is also a fantastic intellectual stirring read, but much longer. Dream of Scipio is really about several things. One of the things it's about is the concept of civilization. What is civilization? What do we mean when we talk about civilization, civilized, one civilization as opposed to the other? And it sort of tests different theories in the narrative about it. It takes place in 3 different times where civilization was in crisis, at stake, being threatened, and really explores this topic through a very engaging novel. And there's one particular passage which I won't be able to quote from memory, it's been some years, where they talk about historians sort of tying down or strapping down or chaining facts with footnotes, and it's just this wonderful passage about what it is that we do as historians and why we do it. I think one of the theories it tests about the nature of civilization is that in some ways it's in the hands of historians, that we have a job in preserving civilization. But then there's also a fantastic passage where they're all sitting down to a dinner and just sharing anecdotes and stories and jokes and whatever, and that's civilization. So it's just, there's so many quotable, when if both my paper copy and my Kindle copy are covered in underlines and folded over pages and everything. It's just this fantastic book. And yeah, in my Commonplace book, there would be many pulled quotes from that book.
Yeah, fantastic. That it sounds a bit like what is history now, but a sort of more intellectual kind of.
Well, but it is a novel.
Yeah.
It's a completely fictional novel about 3 different men. Unfortunately, it's the only problem with the book. 3 different men in 3 different times facing these crises, and how in those moments you think about these bigger, deeper questions. It's a fantastic book and quite a quick read. Whereas Instance of the Finger Post, you've got to be committed. Dream of Scipio, it doesn't take long, and yet I think it's so rich.
Yeah. But sometimes it's the smallest ones that take. Yeah. It's the longer thinking about it afterwards that it sort of extends its reading time. So, is there a recipe that you'd like to record? It can be a historical one, family one, new one that you've just started trying.
Okay, I will tell you one, absolutely. And and that is a recipe for something called wacky cake. Now it goes by many different names in different places. I know it as wacky cake. But my understanding of it actually is that it comes from the Second World War and just after in England, I think Britain, because it doesn't involve any eggs or milk. It's a cake that you can make with the main ingredients are obviously some sugar and some cocoa powder, but also oil, and then it uses, I think it's apple cider vinegar. And so it's accidentally vegan, which at the moment I'm a vegan. But it was something that was part of my childhood. My mum would always make it. It's this beautiful, rich chocolate cake. But it has this very interesting history to it. It has a personal history to me. And, as someone who is, my dietary choices are now vegan, it's something that I can carry with me now as well. So yeah, I'm going to go with wacky cake.
This also keeps to a thing because everyone's choosing something chocolate.
Oh, well,
they're all
yes.
historical recipes as well.
What does that say about historians? I wonder, is that something about us, that we are chocolate lovers and therefore we become historians? Or does the historical craft require chocolate?
Yeah. Was it something in your family then, that recipe, or was it?
Yeah, my mum had, I think, gotten it from her mum. Where she had gotten it from, I don't know. It probably was post-war.
Sort of ration.
Yeah, exactly. It comes from rationing. But yeah, I genuinely, it appears to be a family recipe from that time. But I don't know, and I don't know if I could trace it now. Yeah. But yeah, I'll be making it for my kids.
Yeah. Brilliant. So you have one thing that you're grateful for in your life right now, and just one thing that you hope to achieve by this time next year?
Well, I dedicated this book to my children, and so that's the simple answer. And I put in the dedication as well a wonderful line from Thomas More, which is, "It is not so surprising if I love you with my whole heart," which is something he wrote to his children. And then I think there's a line in the acknowledgements as well. He talks about the extraordinary affection for their children that nature has planted in the hearts of parents. And I think he, more than any other subject that I've studied, understood that deep affection of parenthood and wrote about it. And so, I didn't have any children when I started this project. I now have two. And so they've been sort of wrapped up in this project as well. And that, it's something that I felt like I've been able to reach across the centuries, and understand with Thomas More. So yes, of course, my children.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful connecting thread between, sort of probably something you didn't, plan to have that connection with Thomas More, but
no, yeah, and something I want to achieve in the next year. Well, I've got a book that I have to finish by June, so certainly that. But I'll go ahead and say it. I've been playing with a fiction idea, and so I'd love to, flesh that out a little bit more.
Exciting. Yeah, you're already sort of halfway there with sort of this Thomas More book, getting into their world. So yeah, that would require quite the playlist, I think.
Yes.
So just to finish off, one wildcard entry. It can be sort of anything you like, from a pressed flower, a sketch, or an anecdote from a dinner conversation, like you mentioned earlier. So just one thing you'd like to particularly remember that doesn't fit under these categories.
Actually, I'm going to go back to our conversation about tattoos. I have one tattoo, and it's the word love, and it's actually taken from a birthday card that my mom wrote, and it's her handwriting, writing love in the birthday card, because she wrote all of my birthday cards and, you know, Christmas cards and what have you. And so for me, love has always been in my mother's handwriting. So yeah, I in some sense I have already preserved that in the Commonplace book that is me. But yes, I think love in my mother's handwriting would be something I'd want to preserve.
That's such a lovely way to finish. Thank you. I've learned so much about, you know, the connecting threads between your personal life and your writing life. It's been really wonderful to talk to you. So thank you.
Well, it's a fantastic angle you have as a podcast here, because it invites that. So yeah, this has been a really, really fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing more about your 2 book projects that you have in the works. Yeah, I'm sure they'll be as fantastic as this book, you know, because it really it brings together the best of, you know, scholarly and storytelling, and, you know, I really look forward to seeing what you do next, Joanne. So thank you so much for coming on Commonplace. It's been wonderful to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.